All right, so we're going to jump right into more kind of getting ready for your capital raise, what to expect going in. And I don't think I can emphasize this enough as far as just how long fundraising can take. I would say minimum 3 months, and that's from first conversation to close. I've seen some fundraisers take well over 9 months. Gabe probably could have talked to this. I think he went into it thinking, I have so much interest, I'm going to be wrapped up in a couple months. I think from start of first conversation to that 1.2 in the bank was probably about 9 months for him. So, and 200 meetings later. So if you think about that process, it's not for the faint of heart, and it's a big roller coaster ride. You have the ups and downs of people being really excited and really passionate about what you're doing to them kind of discrediting and causing you to second guess all the assumptions you've made. So it's quite the ride, both the highs and lows. There's things that you can do to help shorten the time, but there's also market factors that you just can't control throughout the fundraising. There's things like what's the visibility of your startup? If you have traction, if you have momentum, if you have press, if you've had the ability to attend conferences, if you're a part of an incubator, if there's just ways to expand your network, that can help. Going into a conversation and having a warm lead and a warm introduction can help get those conversations to occur quicker. Relationships, as Gabe mentioned, a lot of his contacts and investors came through relationships that led to other relationships that led to other relationships. And I'm sure, as all of you know, you don't create a relationship overnight, and you don't create a relationship over a 3-paragraph email. So all that type of stuff takes time. I would also say I've found in my own history of having relationships with other entrepreneurs can be really helpful. They can help fast track, open some doors for you. Having relationships with credible advisors can also kind of fast track the process potentially, where they've gotten to know you and they can open up the door to their network. I went through and just tried to lay out, okay, so what do you expect from first conversation to when the money is in the bank? And a lot of times you'll get these initial calls and they might be hey, we'll jump on a 15, 20-minute phone call from you, and then they make a decision, do they want to get to know you more? That often will lead into a more formal pitch, or I'd say this is more common outside of the Valley, where a lot of these meetings are taking place over coffee. They might not be a formal pitch, but they might say, yeah, I'll meet you for a half an hour coffee. You have that one coffee, they say, we're interested, let's have coffee again in a couple weeks. And then you go to the next coffee meeting, and then it might be, hey, we're interested and we want our friends to get together, so why don't we all schedule another time to get together all in the same room, and I'm going to join some of my friends that might invest. So then you're looking at 2 or 3 weeks later, and that group is having the third, fourth conversation. It's usually about that time where they're saying, okay, I think I'm going to put some money in. You can start to gauge their interest a little bit more. I would say if you're going after an actual angel funding that is more sophisticated, the process is run sometimes a little tighter, where you have a formal pitch, and then they might have one more follow-up session after that. And in those types of funds, they have formal voting, where whoever you were pitching will then take it to their partner group and say, I really like this. This is the reason we should invest. Sometimes you will and won't get the opportunity to actually pitch to the rest of the partners, which can be frustrating, right? You're either putting your hands, you're putting all your trust in that one partner who said, I'm going to be the champion of this, and I'm going to try to pitch it to the rest of my investors internally. That's one route. And if they're really convincing, that can be great, because it can fast track it and get the vote done and you're on your way. Other times, that lead investor says, hey, I want you to come pitch at my partner meeting, and you have to convince now 9 other partners or 5 other partners or 2 other partners that we should all we should all say yes to this deal and invest. So those are kind of the different routes and the nuances of who you're talking to. I always think it's helpful as an entrepreneur to ask what their process is, and so that you can try to manage each relationship according to their process. It would be one of the first things that I would ask on a call of, tell me what your investment process looks like. And what I've also found is investors are good at saying one thing and then they completely break the rules. But at least you have some like directional true north of how are they going to approach this, and how do I manage saying, hey, you said after this you're going to go talk to your partners and get back to me. Then 3 days later I would email them, say, how did that conversation go? You have to manage the momentum as much as you can't just have the conversation and hope to hear back. As I think the overall point that I'm trying to make. If someone says, yeah, that's great, let's have coffee, you can't expect that person's going to reach out to you and ask for coffee or set it up. You have to be the one saying, they asked for coffee, I'm going to reach back out and schedule it and stay on it. And so this is where the spreadsheet that Gabe was talking about is really critical, because you might have 50 conversations going and you're trying to manage what was the next step with them. So you have to take, I would encourage you to take pretty diligent notes as far as where everyone's at and what the next step is. Because it's easy to lose momentum with people, even if they have the best intentions and they really like you. Everyone is really busy, gets tons of emails, so you have to really be the champion of staying on top of what's the next step. Then you get to term sheets. From investor voting to term sheets, that can move pretty quickly. We're going to also be talking about the difference between if you self-lead your term sheet versus if the investor puts forth the term sheet. But let's just keep going down this linear timeline. Say they give you a term sheet. Usually you would negotiate that within a week or so, and then once you have a signed term sheet, you would move to due diligence, and that's when all the formal paperwork and process begins to pull together the closing. A lot of times the legal docs can take anywhere between 30 and 60 days, Joe, to negotiate, roughly.
Depends on how motivated people are to get it done.
Right. So super motivated 15 days,
Yeah.
not so motivated, lots of things going on, 60 days.
Yeah.
And can you just touch on that one little detail? What would be a typical term on an angel investor? Like what kind of conditions would be expected from that group?
We're going to go through term sheets. Joe's going to go through an example 3-page term sheet here in the next about hour or so.
Okay.
So you're 30 to 60, that's from when they sign a term sheet to close, or that's from after the due diligence is done?
That's probably signing term sheet, because usually what happens is I find, and Joe, I'd like your perspective on this too. Most of the time when they sign a term sheet, it's really the intention of moving forward. The due diligence at that point is kind of checking their boxes and making sure that they have the summary put together that they did their work. Rarely would they back out during due diligence, as long as there's nothing you were hiding, and not really disclosing throughout getting to know them. But I find that deals can fall apart, but they often are, when they're doing their diligence, they're often also starting the legal paperwork saying, our intention is to close this.
So really the term sheet's the critical milestone?
Yeah.
They don't, and the issue is that a lot of times, at least around here, there's a correspondence that's happening, as part of, so those three things all kind of blend together where, the formal due diligence, they've probably got a pretty good due diligence file on you before they do sign the term sheet. And they can usually finish their formal due diligence the time it takes the lawyers to actually get the documentation in place and negotiating with the legal. So it all kind of blends in together.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you're waiting for them and they're not waiting for you. You can control your side of that equation, and then you can hopefully kind of exert some influence on their side by pushing them a little bit. People don't like to be pushed, but who could be upset if the company, the CEO of the company they want to invest in is really diligent on follow-up? So you're taking a little bit by being attentive. I think that's okay.
Mm-hmm. So hopefully kind of talking through all the nuances of even all those meetings, you can get a feel for why this process really takes a while, and as Gabe mentioned, it really becomes a full-time job, depending on the amount of money you're going to raise. I think another critical question as you're preparing to fundraise is how much are you going to raise, and really getting clear on what are you trying to accomplish, and then backing into what's the amount of money that it's going to take to accomplish those milestones. It's typical that people would raise for a 15 to 18 month runway, so that gives you enough time to have some ups and downs in what you're executing against. That gives you some ups and down time with customers, and frankly, it takes time to prove things out. Usually, of like, this is what I want to accomplish. So 15 to 18 months is typically a fair amount of time that you can show enough progress to then, if you have to go raise money again. You want to raise enough that you can get to some major milestone that if you need to raise money again, you're in an attractive state. Sometimes people are like, oh, I'll just raise for like 8 months, but they don't accomplish enough to then go start another fundraising. And if it takes that long to fundraise, you should pretty much start fundraising again when you close. So that's kind of why this kind of 18 month is enough traction. It gets you far enough out to like make some meaningful progress, and then start up the 9 month process again if you need more money. Also, there's sometimes this notion of, hey, I just want to go raise a lot of money now so I don't have to worry about it later. Well, that comes at a trade-off. More money now, you know, makes today easier, but it can mean that your valuations are a little, out of whack, and how much of the company you're willing to give away without a lot of progress. Mark Suster says it great, if having a lower valuation makes tomorrow easier. So the next time you go out to raise, if you weren't at a crazy valuation, it makes that next fundraising possible. So you just want to consider all the trade-offs of, and the time, if it's going to take a ton of time to raise $1 million, but you think you could probably get 500,000 done relatively quickly, get back to work and show a lot of meaningful traction, you might consider raising the lower amount and giving up less of your company, because hopefully in another 12 months you're going to show significant progress. You could raise at a higher valuation, etc. There's no magic in this, but it does come back to some key. It comes back to math, ultimately, of what do you want to accomplish and in what time frame, and you can do that math a lot of different ways. Does anyone have questions about how much to raise? Maya?
All of my questions come back to coastal versus Midwest. But we've heard generally coastal, if you don't say you're raising $1 million, they won't look at you, versus like, should you be more realistic at 500,000, that looks okay here.
It's a great point. I'm going to skip ahead a couple slides. So this is typically, you can tell by region, and Brian made a good point. It's not just about Midwest. The East and the West Coast have a very different approach than like you'd see Germany, France, like Austin, Texas, Colorado, etc. I would say if you're not on the coast, everywhere else, you're probably going to run into similar trends. If you're raising on the coast, you tend to raise more money early on. Like they just seed and early angel groups, they don't kind of want to mess around with 250K. They might be more interested in a $1 million to $2 million round. Locally, if you were doing a $2 million, I would say if you're outside of the coast, if you're doing a $2 million round, people are going to kind of look at you like you might be a little aggressive. So it's tailoring, that also might influence who do you want to raise from. Like it comes back to, do you want to appeal to your audience, or do you want to set the vision and go find the money that meets your vision? I would encourage find the investors that meet your vision over let the audience dictate that. But it's also kind of where can you get the money. If you feel like you can't build any of those relationships, you might adjust your strategy to be more conservative for the audience that you have access to. Does that answer your question?
This, I have no idea, so that's what I'm asking, I guess. But with like both the coasts as opposed to the Midwest, is that also tied into possibly like the cost to upscale? I suppose like engineering talent here is less than engineering talent on the West Coast, or is that kind of built into that too?
Yeah, somewhat. Overall, they say that the cost to start up a company has gone down so dramatically in the last 15 years that it just costs less to start companies. But yeah, the salaries that you're looking at in San Francisco versus anywhere else are quite a bit different for an engineering team. So it does play in it in some sense. But it's also an investor's time. What do they want to mess around with? Like if it's too small, even they might just say, yeah, it's great that you don't need that money because you're not in the valley and you're not paying $120,000 for a 21-year-old tech right out of college. They don't really care. They're kind of like saying we don't do less than $1 million investments at this stage. Joshua.
So for the 15 to 18 month runway, if your business is building a product and it takes longer than that, you want to get to a milestone where you just show significant progress, even if that means your product's not finished yet?
Correct. And I think that Gabe talked to that a little bit, but a little bit more of his map was he had to get the product to a certain point to reach a testing milestone and actually start doing his pilots. He knew that super early on, going and raising $3 million would probably just not be a reality because people are like, you still don't have a product. Why am I going to give you $3 million to just say, here's 2 years worth of runway? So that's where he had to break his down into, $1 million something gets me to a very significant product milestone where I have testing and feedback and can show that I can execute on a hardware product. And then he's been able to take that momentum and say, I reached this milestone, I said what I was going to do, I executed on it. Now this is the next milestone I'm going to do with the next set of funds.
So I'm not sure exactly how to ask this question, but I have a physical product. And in the first couple of years, I got some pretty good traction quickly. Didn't know anything about the entire fundraising, money raising ecosystem. I was just kind of born a bootstrapper. Well, what's the next step and how do I have to do it and how can I scrape together the resources to do it? So I did that as far as I could, developed a second product, filed a patent, and was out of cash. I spent a year kind of languishing, driving for Uber and trying to keep the rent paid and keep the business alive, and did so. About a year ago, I got the demonstration fund from the state of Iowa, and we were able to bring some costs down, make some adjustments. I'm still running the company, largely the one-man operation. So I was almost through the Startup Factory program up in Ames when someone said, raising money is going to take like a year at least, and it's going to be your full-time job. Well, I wake up every morning with fires to put out, a company to run, and I don't have a team of employees. I don't really have any full-time employees. How do I?
That's the classic dilemma of early stage companies, right? It's you go from one is prioritization, like what can you put on autopilot? What can you find? There's times where you can find co-founders to help take on some weight if the opportunity is big enough. Other times it's being like, if I'm going to get this done, unfortunately I'm going to be working 16 hours a day, and I'm going to have to commit to doing that for X amount of time, knowing that that's not sustainable forever. But that's why there's a fair amount of burnout in startups, because the amount of time that you're personally invested to do what it all needs to take to do with little resources is more than most people are willing to put in. I mean, this is not an 8-hour a day type of job when you're running startup, as you know, right? And it's prioritizing where are you going to spend your time, and does that thing really have to get done versus something else? And when we say fundraising is a full-time job, it might not be every single day 9 to 5, but you have to approach it with an intensity of the same intensity you do with sales, of if I have a lead, I gotta follow that to a close. So what to expect when it comes to valuation? The magic science behind valuations. There's not a magic science, but really it does come down sometimes to math. And investors expect a certain percentage ownership often of your company. In the venture capital angel world, what is typically, what you'll find kind of a trending across the board is investors expect to own 20 to 25% of your company. And when I say investors, that's not if you had 10 individual investors, they're not each expecting 20%, but if you're doing a round, I know the math doesn't work. If you're doing a round, like an angel round, that group of investors would want to own 20% roughly. We're going to go through the stages a couple slides from now. That can be slightly different very early on in seed and A, like it might be down to 15%. Sometimes it's up to 25, 30%. We'll go through some of those nuances, but generally for the math sake of like how you set your valuation is assuming they want to own 20 to 25%, then your valuation is, typically that 3 to 4 times the amount you're looking to raise. So an example, if you are doing $1 million raise, 25% of $1 million is $4 million. $1 million, 20% of $1 million is $5 million. So that backs into what your valuation has to be.
What if you just want to raise less money, but you think the valuation is X?
It depends on how much traction you have. Some investors just simply won't be interested if it only buys 5 to 6% or 10% of the company, because they want a significant ownership stake. Other types of like angel groups, they're maybe less hung up on I need 20% of this for it to be worth my time. So it depends on who your audience is, a big part of that. And I fast forward to this earlier, but you can see the valuations really change by region of the world that you're raising from, but the math doesn't stay the same. So the math still is that 3 to 4x, 20% in the valley. You can just see what the valuation is a little bit different. And typically in Iowa, super early on, we're seeing sub 500K at a $2 million valuation. So the math is consistent, just the amounts you're raising drive the valuation. There's a ton that you can read on valuations as well. There's some more in the appendix. We used to spend a lot of time on this in prior classes. So there's 4 or 5 slides in the appendix that feel free to reference those later and look online. There's a lot of opinions around valuations. I would also say valuations are set by the market. It's like what's someone willing to buy and at what price? Just like your house, right? You can think it's worth something, but if someone won't pay that, then it's not valued at that.
Have valuations been known to change depending on what geographic location you are?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, some geographic locations, they're getting a little more aggressive. I would also say one of the slides in the back shows there was a really hot period in certain segments of what people were getting invested in, and they were getting crazy valuations. And it's because there was momentum on that specific space. You were seeing companies get $100 million valuations with no customers.
I meant for the same company, will it change valuation depending on geographic location?
Yes, yes. So if you go the route of not setting a valuation, it's likely a term sheet you get from one geographic area to the other could have different valuations. Sometimes there's different strings attached and different philosophies attached to those as well. So you have to weigh, is a higher valuation worth the philosophy of that investor? Because a higher valuation can really hurt you later on as well. That's where you get into a down round. Say you're worth $5 million today, and you go to raise again, and they say you still look like you're worth $5 million because you haven't really changed enough in the last 12 months.
So lastly on that,
Sorry about that. Well, like a higher valuation today. I mean, if you're going to show growth, say you have to raise money again in 12 months, and you haven't really achieved anything significantly. Maybe the stock market totally tanked. All of a sudden, to raise again, you might have a down round where your valuation is actually less than the first time, which means a lot of people get diluted and like lose part of their investment. So that's why you don't always want to maximize valuation, because it can hurt you later on. It's not always the best thing.
Do you have to have a valuation number? Sometimes they say, think that I've got a number in mind as an answer to what are you doing?
Right. There's different approaches to it. It's when the company self-leads with their own term sheet, then you have to have a valuation in mind. If you go out to market and let the market set the valuation, then yeah, you would often want a position to say, I have something in mind, but I'm going to let the market set the valuation. And I'm going to let, I'm going to be picking the best investor for me at the best terms. We talked slightly about this. Is it an angel round? Is it a seed round? Is it an A round? What do you call it? I wouldn't get overly hung up on what you're calling it. The only thing is I'd be careful of, don't call it an A round if it truly isn't what people are used to in the market being an A round. We ran into this at Dwala. Early on, we called kind of our first $1 million an A round, because here that felt like an A round. In the coast, that would be a seed round or an angel round. And so then when we went to raise a B round at $5 million, they're kind of like, well, a B round's not usually $5 million. A B round's usually like $10 million. So why is this a B round? So we were always kind of a round behind or ahead in the naming. So then we go out and we say, we're raising a C round. And, just the assumptions around where you were at stage in the company kind of created some extra explanation. I mean, it's like you can overcome it and it's kind of all silly, but it's an extra conversation that you don't want to necessarily have. So don't be in a hurry to call it an A round. It's okay to have multiple seed rounds before like jumping to that A round, and make sure that you're truly raising kind of a significant amount of money before you call it an A round would be my advice. Next, if you want to look in your binder, these are the typical kind of fundraising stages and expectations. Again, I say typical. There's no hard and fast around any of this. There's a lot of information here. I'm actually going to just pause and give everyone a little bit of time to read through it, because I think it's hard to read and listen at the same time. And then after you've had a chance to read through it, if there's any questions, let's go through questions, and then otherwise we'll keep on moving.
Certain revenue being expected out of the company?
Yeah, so as you can see in seed, at seed there, it's between 0 and 50,000 recurring revenue. And then you'll see, at the Series A, they expect you to have a decent amount of recurring revenue by that point. That's not always the case. Like there's product companies that take a long time to get to revenue. That still might be 0. But on average, that's you need to start kind of ramping up your revenue. Are there other questions around the stages, expectations?
This looks like it's all kind of tech-based.
That's an accurate statement.
True on non-tech companies?
My experience is really in the tech world, so that is a lot of what I can speak to. I don't know, Mike, Chris, can you speak to the non-tech world? These are generally tech-based company stages. For non-tech companies, are you seeing them kind of mirror these expectations, or the expectations very different and it needs its own research?
It's industry specific, because if you go into medical, there's a whole different layout. If you're in the more physical manufactured products, it's going to depend on what market you're selling to. So this is the one, tech-based one is the one that's mature and has all the money behind it. and the other ones are really boutique. So I wish I could give you a better answer than that.
Yeah, I'd also say like the service industry. I mean, there's people that invest in like straight up service companies, but I don't think there's as much data published as far as what they expect.
They're a lot more boutique, so you don't have tech-based type. You have to literally find the deal makers that are.
Yeah, this data is not like the data I pulled. I mean, this is data like published on the internet that show the trends. So in the tech industry, because they publish all they publish a lot of their data.
And the tech industry is really different because they're very open about the money they put into deals, whereas in some other areas they don't. They don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, or we'll keep moving on? All right. The other thing I would say, don't treat this like a Bible. Treat it as like a directional compass, but don't say, well, Charise said I have to be here, therefore, this is the way it's going to be. We try to provide the data to provide some direction. Advisory boards. So advisory boards aren't expected, but can be very helpful, not only in the way that you run your business, scale your business, have more thoughts and brains working on your business, but it can also be helpful in the fundraising process. I think something to know is, just like anyone you bring on your team, if you bring on an advisory board, they need to be managed as far as what you intend to do with them, how you want to communicate with them, what you want from them. And I think the worst thing is surrounding yourself with a bunch of people and then not setting any sort of expectations as far as why are we in this relationship together. You also want to kind of manage the amount of time that it takes getting a bunch of people up to speed. So what's the value you're getting from them, and what amount of time does it take to invest in those advisors? And then be careful not to over pitch advisors in your pitch deck. Oftentimes, if you overplay your advisors and they truly don't have like a pulse on your company, that can shoot you in the foot, because an investor might pick up the phone and call that advisor and say, hey, I had all these questions, and if your advisor's like, I don't know, I haven't talked to him in like 2 months, you kind of did yourself a disservice in saying, hey, I have this wonderful advisory group that's doing all these things for me. So
can I add to that real quick? The other thing is get their permission, because I've had those calls that say I've never met that person in my life, which you're all done. And I've also been put on there, and I had to call the entrepreneur and say, you weren't supposed to do that. I never gave you that. I didn't want to be on there because, to be honest, the client was acting in a poor manner. So get their permission. And Charise is like, we do call all these people. We're going to call.
Yeah.
And we're not going to tell you first.
It's kind of like putting a reference on a resume, right? Like you want to know that they're in a position to talk positively about you, and if they don't even know that they're being passed around and put on this deck, it puts them not in a great position sometimes to help sell what you're doing. Start networking before you really need the money. Again, relationships take time to develop. So as you think about, okay, how am I going to develop relationships that could blossom into future relationships? I think a couple places that you could start is with other advisors and other entrepreneurs. Advisors in the community are really well connected to the venture capital world, to the angel world, and if you establish credibility with them, they can be a powerful force in opening up introductions to other investors. I think, but they have to have some times getting to know you. I've had a couple people call me and say, hey, can you introduce me to this, and this person? And I'm like, I've never met you. That's my reputation on the line of I only get so many introductions to that person before I lose my credibility with that investor. So there is amount of time of like getting to know someone so that they're willing to make those introductions. And that doesn't have to be a ton of time. That might be, hey, you've met them for 2 hours a couple of times over coffee, and they have excitement and comfort about what you're doing, and therefore they're willing to make some introductions. But it won't just happen overnight. So as you're thinking about how do I get ready for fundraising, starting to build out those connections now is really important. I also think as you start to get connected with angel investors or early stage investors, be mindful of what you're saying, because so much in a startup can change really quickly. And if you talk to them in January and you were going to raise $2 million, and then you talk to them in March and you're raising $500,000, and then you're talking to them in April and you're raising $3 million, they can't follow that journey with you. And they're kind of like, does this person not, like, next month, what's it going to be? So you have to have a little bit of intentionality in how you're positioning the conversation with these angels, so that we all know in startups there are these ups and downs and turns and all arounds. But oftentimes people beyond the entrepreneur can't handle the instability that actually happens in a startup. So you have to be a little more consistent. Also, when you're thinking about who's my customer, what's my product, if the product and customer story is changing every month, you're probably going to have a hard time raising that capital, because you didn't really convince them that you have a focus and you're executing on that. So building the relationships with angels and investors can be a double-edged sword, in the sense of you want to take the time to get to know them, you want to have an open enough dialogue that they can help you with problems. But you also have to be pretty guarded and intentional about the information that's being shared. One other point is, be clear when you are and aren't raising. People get pulled into a lot of meetings, and it's just helpful to say, hey, I'm really just in the point of wanting to get to know you. I'm going to be raising in several months, and I'll let you know when I kick off that process. But then keep in mind when you are raising that you don't forget about them. I've had a couple people burn bridges where they got to know people, then they went to raise money, and they didn't reach out to all those people they'd spent time with. And some of those investors were like, I didn't even get a crack at that deal, and kind of felt a little like put to the side. You never want to burn relationships, so just be mindful of how you're managing those communications and investor relationships. So finding your investor. I think the first step is be clear of, if it's an angel round, a seed round, there's very specific types of investors that invested that round versus a Series A or Series B. Some of the tools that Gabe talked about, Crunchbase, Google. I mean, go out there and find who's investing in your industry. Find your competitors and see who's investing in them. You might not want those same investors, but it starts to open doors as far as, okay, these are the types of investors I should be talking to. There's curated list of investors that focus on certain niches. Generally, you want to, it's kind of like a sales funnel. You want to qualify who you're going to be talking to based on what size of check they normally write, what industries they care about, and maybe what kind of fund size they have. Like, are they actually really active right now, or are they kind of dried up and they're out raising another fund? They might not be a good target for you right now. I mentioned this, but other entrepreneurs can be really helpful in opening doors to investors you've never heard of, if they're in the similar industry that you are. I think you may not have your strategy clear going into it, as far as, am I going to raise from angels? Am I going to raise for VCs? Am I going to raise from friends and family? But I think you should think through what the strategies are, because they're different. I'm trying to think where we're going to get to this a little bit later, so I'm not going to go too far in depth, but there's different strategies from raising from wealthy individuals versus raising from an angel group, and the way that you kind of approach the market could be different based on who you want to raise from, and we'll be spending a little bit of time on that here here in a bit.
So just catching up on the same statement, and probably you'll discuss that later, is most of the people, so the audience here is primarily early stage, pre-revenue, most of them, I guess.
Come on in, Sheldon.
So for them, I think it's all seed round of VC money or angel and, wealthy investors. So for this group primarily, how do you see, where they should start or?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of places. Conferences and some pitch events are really successful based on your style. And this would also be like, who are you as an entrepreneur and what kind of style works best for you? I know some entrepreneurs that are amazing at pitching. So they get a lot of success at going around to all these groups and pitching. I know a couple other entrepreneurs that they've raised a couple $1 million without a pitch deck. And they actually really suck at pitching, but you put them over coffee with someone and they can convince that person up and down and all of their friends to invest. And so part of it is like strategically thinking about who you are as an individual and where you might excel. Sometimes you don't know that, so you try both routes and you start to see where you get the most traction. Gabe mentioned going to conferences. If you can go to industry conferences and start to meet people and network. I think it's really hard to create relationships behind your computer. So it's thinking about how do you get out in the public? How do you get connected with people? How do you build relationships? And that takes a lot of hustle. I don't know if that clearly answered your question, but there's not an easy way. It's just like hustle, hustle, hustle. Some people have a lot of luck on social media. I'm not on social media, so that would not be a route that I would go. But some people get conversations by becoming friends with people on Twitter and doing things on Instagram. And again, it goes back to what method do you think you can be most successful in building those relationships?
And also, one thing I'll suggest is that depending on the person you talk to, some people don't like to be approached that way. There's some, I've noticed even with some of my clients, is that the ones that want to ping you constantly on electronically but don't want to get together face to face. So if you're pitching to somebody, you get the sense that they don't like getting together, they'd rather you email. Watch for those signs that they want something different.
And sometimes you can ask, would you prefer to jump on the phone or do you want to grab coffee?
Yeah.
Or do you want to set up a video conference with a pitch deck, or do you want to just do, an easy phone call? Oftentimes the person, the investor has a preference, so play to their preference when you can. The last point in here is, get good at creating a detailed tracking sheet of all the contacts you've made, and are they yes, are they no, are they maybe, do they invest later stage, okay, you want to reach out to them later. As many next steps as you can capture will help in the process. Really early on, you go to a conference and someone shows a lot of interest, or you go to a pitch competition and 6 people come up to you later, and you get all these cards. And at the time, it's easy to be like, oh, there's all this momentum, but then you lose those cards and you forget to follow up. That was really lost opportunity. That's 6 to 10 people that might have been your next investor. So you're taking the time to do this. Make sure you're being kind of smart about the time and the follow-up. Okay, so strategic investors. This might not be as applicable early on in the seed stage, but I'm seeing more and more companies kind of face this where they have some of their first customers come to them and want to be strategic investors, for example. This can be really helpful in opening doors and having insight. It can be pretty legitimizing if you get a major company to be a strategic investor. They have domain experience, etc. But I think also you should go into it with eyes wide open. Strategic investors also can really hurt and have an influence on the direction of your company long term. Some of the things that can happen is if they have their own self-interest, if they have their own agenda in mind and they're trying to steer your company down that agenda, they can have a lot of control, not only around your mind share, but in the boardroom, on future investments, on customer relationships, on product development. sometimes you can become their outsourced product team. And it's, again, like, is that the direction you want to go down versus setting your vision for the company and say, you know, this is what the market wants, and I'm appealing to a larger market than just my strategic investor. They might block you from doing business with certain businesses, or a competitive business might not want to do business with you if you have a large strategic investor, because they see that as a conflict. So all those things are trade-offs for you to decide, is it worth taking that, you know, strategic money, or would you prefer not to go down that route? And at what stage it can have a different influence of the company as well. Any questions about strategic investors? Okay. Lastly, important is, as you're going through the fundraising journey, is to build momentum. Companies that have momentum, I think, get funded faster and quicker. And momentum can look like a bunch of different things. Momentum might be that you have product and technology momentum. You're able to show, hey, I took this idea and started executing on it really, really quickly, and that creates excitement with investors. It might be that you have some really great early users, and that I think customers speak volumes when it comes to investors, as far as someone is willing to pay for this, someone's willing to use this, you're getting some traction, you're getting feedback, you're iterating. Customers are usually really, really important in showing overall momentum. You could have great product momentum, but if you have no one using it, it might raise some red flags of, is this just a great idea that you have in your head, or is someone really willing to pay for this? Again, sales, industry, if you get great publicity, that can really, really help. And then partnerships, thinking through who have you been able to build partnerships with from both a distribution side, a manufacturing side, a marketing side, overall brand awareness. All of these areas, the more traction you're able to show, I think the more success you'll have in convincing an investor that this is a company that has traction, that's moving forward, and is, you know, something they should get really excited about.